You so much for having me here. And that was an amazing presentation, Sid. You covered so many points. So I guess I thought actually to brush up a bit on the history of Palestine. And I know this seems so basic for a lot of people, but I think it's important because until now we are bombarded by disinformation. And I think this is something that we really need to be fighting back against. So I wanted to highlight how, at the root of what we're facing as Palestinians is Zionism. So I'm a Palestinian third generation refugee, as I was introduced. My father comes from the city of Ramle, which is part of what's now called Israel and what we refer to as 1948 Palestine. My mother is from a village called Madama near the city of Nablus, which is currently under Israeli occupation. So Zionism emerged about in the late 19th century, and it was in Europe. And the idea was to create a Jewish state in Palestine. And the problem was at the time that Palestine, only 5% of the population was Jewish. The vast majority were Muslim, and there's a sizable Christian minority. So what happened was that the Zionist movement recognized that in order to create a Jewish state, they actually had to ethnically cleanse the vast majority of the population. And they were okay with that because at the time, any country outside of Europe was seen as open to colonization. And then we saw, of course, through the Balfour Declaration in 1920, or 1917 more specifically, Britain secretly agreed, as it was occupying Palestine at the time, to hand Palestinian land to Zionists without indigenous consent or knowledge even. And that's when we began to see a lot of Jewish migration happen. And I want to point out that Zionism is also an anti-Semitic movement, because for a lot of these, like Theodor Herzl, the founder of the movement, actually argued that the fault of anti-Semitism, it was to be blamed on Jewish people, and they had to leave Europe and they had to colonize in order to become more European. So Zionism was very much an anti-Semitic movement. And they had other countries in mind besides Palestine, like Uganda, Argentina. Herzl also suggested mass conversion to Christianity. In any case, by 1948, about 90% of Jewish people who migrated to Palestine or colonized Palestine were of European origin. And this is really important just to highlight how at the end of the day, this is a white supremacist state, the state of Israel. So yeah, you'll hear sometimes Zionists now trying to argue, oh, like most of, Israelis are people of color. Well, that's true now, but at the time, it was largely founded by white Jews, and until now, we see a huge hierarchy. So Ethiopian Jews are treated horribly there. You can read about that. And then, of course, we see Ashkenazi or white Jews really leading, the state. So in 1948, by that time, Britain has really trained and supported the Zionist colonizers while undermining Palestinians. So we weren't allowed to have arms, socially we weren't supported. And in 1936, there was a huge revolt against mainly the British that was led by Palestinians. Actually, outside of Algeria, we had the strongest anti-colonial resistance in the world. And people don't know that. And it was crushed. The British really massacred and expelled a lot of Palestinians at the time. And so by the time 1948 came, when Zionist militias really began to kill Palestinians and forcibly expel them, and I really recommend for this the book by Ilan Pappé, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. He talks about how, it was planned, how to ethnically cleanse it. They destroyed hundreds of villages. They expelled about 80% of the Palestinian population, including my dad's family. That's about almost 800,000 people. And that's how they cleared the way for what's called Israel. So they actually took 78% of Palestine in 1948. And then in 1967, Israel occupied the remaining 22%. And Israel could have easily annexed the remaining 22%, but they decided to occupy it because they don't want to have Palestinians as part of their demographics, right? Because that takes away from their Jewish majority. And also they don't want to give rights to Palestinians. So now they can control our land and resources while, oppressing us, etc. So, and since then, as Sid was highlighting, Israelis have just been taking more and more of our land. So when you look at the map, if you look at the disappearing map over the years, Palestine has just become split into like morsels. Like, you can't even imagine a two-state anymore. So actually, and also a two-state would not be fair because, The 80% of Palestinians who were expelled from Palestine were never allowed to return. I've never even been allowed to visit my father's city, even though we have a Canadian citizenship, because I have a Palestinian ID for my mom. So, as UN Resolution 194 says, Palestinians have the right to return. So a one-state solution is the just solution and the only feasible one, which is that Israel needs to grant, Palestinians the right of return, recognize the equal rights between Jews and non-Jews. And so I guess that was like I just want to highlight how Zionism is really at the root of all of this, and we need to combat this movement as a racist movement. And Canada's role in this is quite disgusting, because we see actually a lot of the racism being leveled by Canada is actually tied to Islamophobia. So trying to paint our resistance as terrorist, or you see that word terrorist only used for Palestinians. We don't see that used for Israel, right? We don't talk about state-sanctioned terror. And again, the idea that they're pointing at indigenous people resisting, because especially Gaza, we look at, not only has it been under illegal occupation since 1967, but it's been besieged for the last 17 years by Israel. They've literally been on a diet by Israel, like on a starvation diet. They count their calories. It's been called uninhabitable by the UN by the time of 2020. And as Sid highlighted, Palestinians have tried to peacefully resist. We've tried to resist in every single way, from the March of Return in 2018 to other ways, and we've been massacred. We've seen journalists and doctors. They've been, just assassinated by Israel. And, people talk about indiscriminate attacks by Hamas when it's like, A, they don't have near the technology of Israel, near the scale of its destructiveness. And B, also, we have to recognize that people under occupation, colonization do have the moral and legal right to resist under international law, and that includes armed struggle. So today I saw an article actually from CBC, and it was talking about how the Ontario Education Minister is trying to introduce more education around the Holocaust in secondary schools. And I want to talk about that because like what Canada's trying to do and Israel and the West is trying to conflate this and make it into a religious war when it's not. This is actually, of course, like it's just like Canada, right? Israel is a settler colonial project that seeks to eliminate all the indigenous people to take all of their land. So settler colonialism is a perpetual, and it's a genocidal project. And it's also anti-Semitic for them to make that argument that like, so basically the CBC article argues that Canada is going to be making over $160 million donation to Jewish community groups. Well, those two Jewish community groups are CJA, which is the biggest Israeli lobby in Canada, and Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center, which is also another big Zionist group. So these are two, pro-apartheid Israeli groups that are being labeled Jewish community groups at the time, and Canada is donating to them. And at the same time, it's like, let's give Holocaust education to high schoolers when what is happening is, unfortunately, Israel's using the memory of the Holocaust. They're weaponizing resistance against anti-Semitism to try to paint Palestinians as the anti-Semites and try to paint us as the aggressors and, allow that to greenlight our Nakba or our Holocaust. And I wanted to highlight, so Nakba was actually a word that was coined by the Israeli army back in 1948. Nakba in Arabic means catastrophe. And Israel used it at the time when they were dropping leaflets on Haifa to say to the indigenous Palestinians, you need to flee because we are going to do the Nakba to you. And actually the Haganah archives, which is the pre-Israeli army, they show that Israel translated Nakba in Hebrew to Shoah, or the Holocaust. So Israel was literally like, we are going to do the Holocaust to you as Palestinians. And now we're seeing, Holocaust education introduced into the high school curriculum. But what about like what Palestine's going through right now? We don't have even Holocaust survivors because we are still going through the Nakba, right? So I guess that's most of what I want to touch on. I want to talk about a bit of what's happening right now in terms of resistance. So I saw on November 13, actually just today, there's a school strike being planned. So a lot of people in different high schools are planning to just stop going to school until Canada takes action, which is really amazing. And also we are seeing this Saturday, there's going to be a huge action in Toronto. It's called the 100K rally. They're trying to pull 100,000. So like Sid said, we needed those kind of numbers to see Canada not go to Iraq. So we need to pull those numbers and we need to be united more than ever. I saw on this Saturday, there's a rally being planned in Markham by a Muslim group for Palestine at the same time. And I was so angry. And I called them yesterday and they were, giving me a hard time. But this is like, it's just unfortunate. Like, this is the importance of like centering Palestinian voices right now and taking leadership from them, and we see egos and we see like, differences, and we shouldn't be. This is, people are being killed right now, and this is the time we should be united, right? So I think this is really important right now. How do we, how do we organize buses, got car rallies, make sure we pull those turnouts. I also want to talk about disruptions. So besides targeting weapon companies that we've seen, sit-ins at MP offices, we can look at shutting down Bay Street as the economic hub, or we can look at going to Pearson Airport, right? Trying to create these kind of disruptions, talk to the state through money, like how it understands, right? And look at different segments of the Canadian population. So there's definitely like a lot that can be done. And I wanted to say, if anybody's interested in organizing in Toronto or not in Toronto, they're welcome to reach out to me. My name is, again, Ghada Sasa. You can find me on like Twitter or my email. And yeah, I guess, yeah, that's mostly what I wanted to touch on. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ghada. I'm just turning the computer here. We have a little group in the book room and then a bunch of people online. That was a fantastic presentation, and thanks, Sid, as well, for kicking the meeting off. What we'll do now, people may have questions or they may have contributions they'd like to make. If you could raise your hand for those on Zoom, and those here in the room, just raise your hand as well. And I'll take a speakers list and call on you in turn. And we'll have about 25 minutes or so. We could probably do 35 minutes for discussion, if that's okay with the speakers. And then we can have you both come back and respond to questions. And so the floor is open, and please just raise your hand in the Zoom or here in the room.
And messages. So I guess regarding the point of like the Iraq war, how the Iraq war kept going even when Canada didn't enter. That's true, and Canada still behind closed doors did very much support the U.S. And we still went into Afghanistan. So I think like that this is an important point, and I think at some point we just kind of let go. We just kind of gave up, or just we did our job. And I think the important thing is that we keep going, right? We don't just end in protest. Like you said, this is not just a war against imperialism, this is a war against capitalism. I also heard the Omar Barghouti, who's a co-founder of the BDS movement. So the boycott movement, we founded it in 2005, okay? And it was modeled after the South African anti-apartheid movement there. And it took them 31 years in order to pressure the apartheid regime to fall and to release Nelson Mandela. And I actually saw there was a map from Visualizing Palestine, and it was showing how, in a way, the anti-apartheid movement for Palestine is actually progressing faster than the South African one. And, similar to what Sid's saying, you would hope to see that because, we'd hope that we have learned from the past. But at the same time, you still see South Africa as maybe the most unequal place in the world right now. They got rid of political apartheid, but we still have economic apartheid because they never got to redistribute the wealth. And so I saw Omar Barghouti saying how, yeah, there's a lesson for us to learn, which is that we have to make sure that we go after capitalism. And someone was talking about the violence of the nation state. So again, I take my cue here from post-colonial scholars and Marxists saying, after we seize the state, then we work on dismantling the state. So yeah, there's a lot of work ahead. But I think I'm definitely feeling inspired despite all the trauma. We lost in the last couple of weeks, we lost on my father's side of the family 46 family members. It's extremely traumatic. Besides what's happening in the West Bank, every day now we are being terrorized. Every day I'm scared to talk to my family because the settlers there, they've always been armed, but now they're more armed than ever. They're attacking us, especially now because October is olive harvest and just trying to, terrorize people, force them off our land, force us off our land. And they're just like killing, people, and the soldiers are killing people, so nobody's doing anything about it. But yeah, I did want to mention that like there's definitely a lot to learn, but I think it's also important for us to stay hopeful. And I know this can be really hard to hold on to right now, but I personally believe that Palestine will be free within this decade. And even now, like it's just incredible seeing today, I think there's like 17 Israeli soldiers killed. They're still trying to do the ground incursion and they can't because Hamas is very much operating like how the resistance fighters operated in Vietnam against, again, a leading world power at the time, right? They just can't compete with Hamas, and they keep putting off the ground invasion. And so it's really something to watch. And, we talk about the Arab region and like what they're doing. And yeah, it's very disappointing. I saw this picture yesterday comparing London, seeing this mass protest in London that we've all seen. And then in Saudi Arabia, there's like fireworks. Because again, like in Saudi Arabia, so-called Islamic State, and it's not, in my opinion. In the Gulf region, there's mass like suppression of free speech. So people, even though they're pro-Palestine, they can't even like express themselves, right? And it's like they're deeply collaborative with Israel. And this is not new. This is like from the 90s. Like my mom in the UAE, I was born in the UAE. Like she had her CDs, like her house was rated just because she did theater. Like she just did plays for Palestine. And so yeah, like I think we definitely are seeing shift there, especially Jordan. I know recently they were going to meet with like the American president and they just put that off because like there's mass protests happening, people burning the consulates in Lebanon. Like, so yeah, there's definitely a lot to watch out for. In terms of how to deal with the political system here, I actually have drafted a petition last week. I have it pinned on my Twitter, but it's basically calling on MPs who support Palestine to quit their parties or resign. I know it seemed counterintuitive, but in my opinion, the NDP and Liberal parties are completely gone, never mind the Conservative one. So we've had about 33 MPs sign a statement calling on Canada, to do a ceasefire. But yeah, we don't think that's enough. We don't think these parties are redeemable. I was actually supposed to be in Parliament yesterday. MP Salma Zahed from Scarborough is the chair of the Canada-Palestine Friendship Group, and I was initially invited to present. I mean, I basically asked if I could present, and they agreed about 2 months ago. And then suddenly last week, they canceled on me and then ghosted me. And then yesterday, when I called them out for doing that, Salma just blocked me for her Twitter. So that again just emphasizes my point that these people, even so-called allies, are simply not there for us. Like we have to be pressuring them to do better. And that's another thing I wanted to point out, which is we need to be careful of like grifters at this moment. We see a lot of people, even, I fell into this, like I'll retweet someone and then I realize like, wait, this person is like pro-Trump, like he has the US flag in his bio, like everybody's retweeting him, and there's a lot of grifter organizations, a lot of liberal NGOs. Last week, I was suspended from Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, which is supposed to be a leading pro-Palestine solidarity group in Canada. Okay, but it's led by two white men. And let's just say I'm not the first Palestinian voice that they've suppressed. And they literally released a statement last Saturday, I think, to us as board members being like, we're encouraging you to not talk about Palestine publicly. Like, how do you talk to Palestinians saying, so this whole like white savior complex is going on. and them just, being very liberal, like wishy-washy, achieving little on the ground. So yeah, so I think it's really important we be careful, which sounds counterintuitive because I said we need to be united, but at the same time, I think, yes, we also have to be aware of grifters. How do we build like genuine solidarity founded on principle between different people? Yeah, so I'm gonna keep it there.